me for my voice, but I have never seen anything like it.
Do you believe in miracles? Yes! Unbelievable.
Hey, welcome back to the podcast. If you're just tuning in, this is the second installment of the 2010s Decade's Best Player, where we're ranking them down from 83 to number 1. In case you forgot, 83 different players made an All-Star game this decade. So we ranked them who was the best player of the decade to who was the worst, with the only stipulation being you had to make at least one All-Star game during the time period. All right, let's get into it. We stopped at number 67 with the Big Three MVP, Joe Johnson. Moving on to number 66, the first player we're breaking down today is a guy who's played 9 seasons in this decade. I've said before that matters to me. If you have the majority of your career in this decade, I think that means a little bit more. Not only because we got to see more of you, not only because we got to kind of see a little bit more of your rise and fall, but you made more of an impact in this decade. Guys like Yao Ming, who we mentioned yesterday, guys like Bam Adebayo, who only played 3 seasons this decade. They haven't had enough time to mature and grow and make an impact on the daily and the weekly and the yearly consciousness of the NBA fan. This guy who had been moved from the 76ers to Orlando, where he's now made a little bit more of a career for himself, it's Nikola Vucevic, who has played 9 seasons this decade, averaged 16 points and 10 rebounds, one of the few players to average a double-double in this decade. But he is the third guy in this group of players, the 16 players we're breaking down today, who's averaged a double-double. Why does that matter? Well, consistency is key. And while Vucevic has only made 1 All-Star game, he's one of the more consistent players on this list, shooting the ball quite well at 53% true shooting percentage and having a win share of 17.7. I'm sorry, a total win share of 47.2, but a value of replacement of 17.7. He is the epitome of a solid NBA big man. As the league has gotten smaller, he still has an impact on the game. That can't be understated, I don't think. I like Vucevic. He's a very good NBA player. An all-star he was once, but I think that we're going to remember him more as a solid, good player, not a guy you can really build a championship team around. Next on the list is a dude that played 7 seasons. He started this decade playing for a team that was knocking on the door of trying to get back to the NBA Finals. He left the league after Draymond Green made fun of him while he was playing for the Clippers. It's Paul Pierce. Played 7 seasons this decade, averaged 14 points per game, gave us 14.7 points per game in the playoffs, didn't make an NBA Finals appearance, only made 2 All-Star games in this decade. Why does that matter to me? Well, Paul Pierce, for the most part, played the better part of his career in the 2000s. The 2010s were not kind to Mr. Pierce. He's went from being a guy who gets traded to the Brooklyn Nets in one of the most lopsided trades in NBA history, where I think everybody at the time thought him and KG were going to make an impact on the new Brooklyn Nets. They, of course, made an impact, but it wasn't a good one. He then goes to the Washington Wizards, where he hits a very big shot to win a game for the Wizards in playoffs. He called bank, quote-unquote. He goes to the Clippers, a team that for the majority of this decade was looking for a small forward to fill the role that they desperately needed. They never were able to fill that role until very recently. This last offseason, they were able to get 2 small forwards in Kawhi and Paul George. Paul Pierce didn't fit that either. He was a guy who this decade would not smile very fondly upon. Why is he higher than some of the other guys on this list? Well, it's quite easy. Those 2 seasons in the beginning of the decade, 2011, 2012, he made incredible runs with the Celtics. And I don't say that as a Celtics fan. I say that as an NBA fan. Those Celtics teams were on their very last leg, and Pierce did his best to get them over the hump. He and the Celtics were in the point of almost making the NBA Finals in 2012, and then LeBron went supernova and beat him. He is number 65 on the list. At number 64, Drew Holiday, who shockingly only made 1 All-Star game, but has been, I think, one of the better point guards in this league. He is another dude who I think fits more into the very good, but not all-star good. He made one all-star game when playing with the 76ers. He, of course, got traded to the Pelicans while the 76ers were trying to move off of all of their salary guys. He's had a lot of family issues, has dealt with a lot of physical issues himself. They never could get him and Anthony Davis on the same page. Now he's in a very weird position as being the veteran role player or veteran leader on a Pelicans team that has Zion and Lonzo Ball and Brandon Ingram. Jrue Holiday is an interesting case because he also played 10 seasons this decade, averaging about 16.8, and 6.7 assists per game. In the playoffs, he averaged 14.7 points. He averaged 17 points per game. He's a dude that in that series that Anthony Davis went completely crazy and beat the Portland Trailblazers essentially by himself. People forget Jrue Holiday had a pretty good series that year too, especially with Boogie going down with an Achilles injury. Jrue Holiday stepped up. Is he a guy who you would want to be on your playoff team? Of course. I think that he would fit the role of a Kyle Lowry very well, but he's never been put in a position to really succeed, I don't think. He's been on bad team after bad team. That's why he's only made one All-Star game, but he hasn't helped himself enough, in my opinion, either. He's not a guy who you would write off as not a starting point guard in the NBA, but he's also not a guy who's going to make an All-NBA team, I don't think. He is number 64 on the list. And number 63, a guy who's just recently been traded to the Cleveland Cavaliers, but he had a pretty good career in the Motor City. He's played 7 seasons this decade. In this decade, averaged 14.5 and 13.8, almost a 14-14 type of guy. He played next to Greg Monroe in one of the weirdest starting lineups that I can remember, especially a Greg Monroe, Andre Drummond starting lineup in 2020. Feels so foreign to me. It doesn't make a ton of sense. With the league moving small, he doesn't fit, I don't think. That lineup is just comical to me. But he's now playing for the Cleveland Cavaliers on a team that's not going to be relevant anytime soon. They're log jammed at the big man position between Kevin Love and Tristan Thompson and Andre Drummond. He's another guy who is small enough and quick enough, I think, still in his prime, to make an impact on a playoff team. He's not good enough currently to lead a team by himself. Averaged 15.5 and 11 in the playoffs. Never made a finals. Made 2 NBA All-Star games. Value over placement 16.3. So one of the higher in this group. Moving on to D'Angelo Russell. A guy who, let's be completely honest here, a very turbulent decade for young D'Angelo Russell. He's only played 5 seasons this decade. It's in his 5th season. But man, has it been up and down for him. He gets drafted by the Lakers, snitches on Nick Young, immediately traded to the Nets in a contract swap that didn't make a ton of sense at the time. I'm still not totally in love with the way he plays. I think that there's a lot of there's too much shooting for a guy that's supposed to play point guard. But he gets moved to Minnesota with Karl-Anthony Towns and potentially in the future Devin Booker, I think. And he's going to be a very good player. The reason that he's higher than some of the other guys on the list is the potential, to me, is the upside. And he showed enough upside in the games that he played this decade to be higher than Drummond, higher than Paul Pierce, higher than Jrue Holiday. I think that the potential of him is going to make fans really glom to him. Also, at his very peak, at his best, he plays better than Jrue Holiday. Let's be real. But if you took any of the guards, I think, in this group and said, well, I want to move him higher or move him lower, I think that you could. Moving number 61, he played 9 seasons this decade. Another guy who played a ton of years. His best years came in the last decade, where he won 3 titles. But he made an NBA All-Star game this decade. He played in 2 finals, winning 1 and having an incredible 2013 finals. He was able to make 3 All-Star games this decade, averaging 14 points, 5.6 assists, 16 points in the playoffs with 5 assists. It's Tony Parker. Tony Parker is higher than any of the other point guards on this list right now. Him and this next guy really fought for that next position. But this next guy, I think, is the future of the league, and Tony Parker is the past. Parker, an incredible career, an amazing time with the San Antonio Spurs. It's a blemish that he played with the Charlotte Hornets for 1 season. He could have played in his entire career with one franchise. That's very rarely done, especially in this current NBA to play your entire career with one team. I thought it was a real shame that he played a season with the Hornets. But another one of those all-star NBA players who plays his last years on a team that you're not really going to remember, so we'll give him a pass. At number 60 is Trae Young. Why is Trae Young higher than Tony Parker, you might ask, after only playing 2 seasons in the NBA, averaging at 23.6 points, 8 assists, and 3 rebounds. He's never made a playoff series, never won a playoff series. And why is he higher than Tony Parker? Well, I think that Trae Young made a big enough impact and is a big enough player, has done enough currently in the league to relevant a higher position than Tony Parker. And hear me out. He plays for the Atlanta Hawks, a team that is very bad. Basketball in Atlanta would be dead without Trae Young. Basketball in San Antonio without Tony Parker, I think that fans would still show up. That's why Trae Young is a little bit higher than Tony Parker to me. Even though Tony has a finals victory this decade, even though that he's won a title this decade, I still have him a little bit higher. I still have Trae Young a little bit higher than Tony Parker. At number 59, I had to put him higher than Trae Young because of the Rookie of the Year. I didn't even have Rookie of the Year as a real breaker, but when we got to Parker, Trae Young, and Luka all having the exact same type of score in my head, I gave Luka the nod. Luka Doncic makes his first All-Star game this year, has proven to be an incredible player, averaging 24.4 points, 7 assists, 7 rebounds. Again, if the NBA season that isn't cut short, he makes the playoffs this year with the Mavericks in his second season. He is a generational superstar. The Mavericks accidentally, call it a fate, they accidentally found themselves with a dude who is going to be a very special player going forward. There's no way that he doesn't map out to be one of the best forwards in the next 5 to 10 years. Every year for the next 10 years, you're going to be in the conversation, or if not in the conversation, on the All-NBA team. I think you can chalk it in. That's how special Luka Doncic has been in just 2 seasons. Should he be higher? Maybe, but I can't justify him being higher than some of the other guys on this list because he hasn't done enough this decade. Only 2 seasons. It's real hard for me to put him higher. He is higher than D'Angelo Russell. He's still higher than Drew Holiday again because he's just a better player than either one of those guys. At number 58 on the list, another guy who played 10 seasons this decade, averaged 17 points per game, 5 rebounds. In the playoffs, averaged 15, almost 16 points per game. He played for the Los Angeles Lakers to start, goes to Chicago on a team that I don't know if they were a favorite. I don't think that they were an underdog. But they weren't. They were just one of those middle-of-the-road teams in Chicago where he plays power forward. Then he goes to San Antonio, and he was just an albatross around the Spurs' neck. It's Pau Gasol. Gasol plays his best seasons in the last decade where he wins an NBA Finals to end the decade. He was the best player in Memphis Grizzlies history before his brother got really good. He is, by far, one of the better players of the past decade. This decade, however, he's 58 on the list because he plays on a pretty good Lakers team. He was one of the guys that really showed up day in and day out on that really turbulent 2012-2013 season with Dwight and Steve Nash. He just was good enough to me and had enough longevity to edge out some of the other guys on this list. Some of the other guys that we mentioned on Monday when we talk about where they kind of fit in. Next on the list at 57 is Brook Lopez. Lopez, on the last list that we did, was a lot lower, and I'll tell you why. He was a lot lower because he wasn't very good until he figured out how to be a three-point shooting, rim-protecting big man. It's a smaller court to run up and on the court. He's doing a lot of trailing threes. He fits really good next to Giannis in that defensive set. I really liked what he was able to do when he went to Milwaukee. But before then, he was an often injured big man who made an all-star game early in the decade, but never really had much success afterwards. He only made 1 all-star game this decade, and for as much as he was talked about, we thought he would be a lot better. So, he played 10 seasons, 17 points, 5 rebounds. I expect a little bit more because he should be taller, should be bigger. Never made the playoffs this decade. Never had any playoff success this decade, I should say. It's going to be real tough edging out some of the rest of the guys when you don't do a lot. Moving on to Gordon Hayward. Gordon Hayward, one of the dudes who is supposed to be really good. Only made one All-Star game before he broke his ankle in Boston, and that really, I think, ended any chances he had moving forward. He's not ever going to be the same player that he was. I think anybody who watches basketball, anybody that knows basketball, will agree with that. I think Gordon Hayward finds himself in that same conversation as some of the other great players who got listed earlier on this list. You're thinking of guys like Amari Stoudemire, thinking of guys like Darren Williams, thinking about guys in that they got hurt and they never really were the same. They never could come back. They never could make that same impact they once did. And that's a real shame. And I think that he'd be making more All-Star games if he didn't get hurt. I think that that is just a fact of life. But to be completely honest with you, playing in Utah didn't do him a lot of good, or didn't do him a lot of good when it comes to his brand, I should say. As a player, I think that the system really helped him out. In Brad Stevens' system, I think he's going to be another really good player going forward. But you'll notice his co-teammates, there's a couple guys who've made the list already, who, guys that, or I should say, guys that are earlier on the list, you're going to get in the next couple days, who are better than him, have had better careers, have had more impact this decade. Moving on to number 55 on the list, he won a championship to start the decade, and that's really why he's a little bit higher than some of the other guys on this list. And I thought that he had a bigger impact than Tony Parker. Now, while Tony played in a system in San Antonio, I think that that kind of diminished his true talent. I think that that kind of takes a little bit more away from his ability. Granted, very good playmaker, very good guy who's running offense, but let's be honest here. He individually didn't do a ton, didn't have a lot of exciting, very large impact because it was a team game. This guy single-handedly, I think, changed a couple playoff games. Tyson Chandler. Tyson Chandler wins a Defensive Player of the Year award. Granted, his numbers aren't great, 8 points, 9 assists, and in the second half of the season, the second half of, I should say, the decade, kind of struggled a little bit more, kind of didn't have the same impact. But the first half of the decade, he had a big enough impact to put him higher on this list. Coming in at 54 and 53, these guys were teammates to start the decade and enemies to end it. And the reason that they are where they are, 1 and 54, 1 and 53, is because one of them was able to get that second ring and the other one wasn't. In the last decade, it's not a difficult debate. Kevin Garnett was an MVP. He won a Defensive Player of the Year award. He, by far, was the more impactful, more dominant player of the 2000s. Ray Allen, on the other hand, hits the biggest shot in NBA Finals history. And that's bigger than any Jordan shot. That's bigger than the Kyrie shot. He single-handedly swung a finals game, a finals series. He doesn't hit the shot in Game 6. Infamously, the Spurs walk off on the Miami Heat court. They win the title. They break the backs of the Miami Heat. They stop the repeat. They stop any chance of LeBron having any claim to the all-time great throne. They stopped Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh potentially being teammates because I think they're going to get moved. In one shot, he propelled the Miami Heat legacy, the legacies of LeBron and Wade and Bosh, to a new stratosphere. He makes the Hall of Fame because he was a great shooter. But he makes this list and where he is now ahead of Kevin Garnett because of the shot that he made. Individually, he wasn't better than some of the other guys on this list. Individually, he didn't have the same type of impact as other guys on this list. But I want you to remember something. If you remember nothing from this podcast, remember that Ray Allen is a career-changing player. That if he doesn't go to Boston, the Big Three doesn't work. If he doesn't go to Miami, the Heat don't win. But because he does those things, he is one of the big. He has the biggest moment of the decade. I think that the Game 6 shot surpasses anything else that happened this decade. It surpasses Dirk's finger roll to win a playoff game in 2011 Finals. It surpasses Kobe's 60-point game. It surpasses anything else. It surpasses, even LeBron's Game 7 against the the Warriors, where he blocks the shot on Iggy. All of those are incredible moments, but the Game 6 shot, in my opinion, stands taller and has more a lasting legacy than anything else this decade. He single-handedly changed the course of the NBA. So that's why he's 53 on the list. At number 52, a young guy, 5 years in the league. He's shown me enough to put him where he is. He's more talented than anybody else mentioned before. He's got more upside than anybody else mentioned before. And he is done a lot relatively young. 22 points per game, 11 rebounds. Another guy who's averaged a double-double this decade. In the playoffs, 15 points, 13 rebounds. I wish that he would have had a better team to kind of put around him a little bit more. They haven't done a ton to help him out. We're talking about Karl-Anthony Towns. Karl-Anthony Towns, defensively, not great. His defensive win share is the lowest of this section, or one of the lowest of this section. The only guy who had a lower defensive win share, of course, was Luka Doncic and Trae Young because they haven't played enough games. But Karl-Anthony Towns, detrimental on defense, but offensively he's gifted enough, and I think that he has enough upside, and he's going to be an excellent player in this next decade, in the 2020s. But in the 2010s, he slips in at number 52, making one All-Star game, and a big enough impact on Minnesota to give him the nod. At number 51, and the last player that we're going to talk about on this podcast, he is victim number 0. He's patient 0. He is the guy who, for the rest of his life, will be remembered. He is in the NBA history books as the guy who got the coronavirus. Now, is that fair? No, it's not. Somebody was going to get it at some point, and it's wrong for us to blame him. And the hate that he's gotten is kind of unwarranted, the amount of hate he's gotten. He is an incredible 2010s. Offensively, this guy, kind of a joke. 11 points per game, 11 rebounds. He's averaging a double-double. In the playoffs, 12 and 10. But defensively is really where this guy makes his bread and butter. Makes his money on the defensive end of the court. He wins 2 Defensive Player of the Year awards. He makes a whopping 2 All-Star game, or 1 All-Star game, I should say, this decade. He's a guy who, for the most part, is going to be remembered as the one big man in this small ball era who could stay on the court. And it's to be seen. We haven't seen a team run up against him where they ran him off the court because he couldn't match up with anybody. But when you look at what he did against Harden in the playoffs, when the Rockets played the Jazz, and even when he played the Thunder, he's a big enough guy inside and good enough rim protector that teams can't go at him. They just can't. He's too big. He's too physical. That's good for the Jazz. I don't love the fact that he's a 0 on offense, that he really can't do a ton. I know he led the league in screen assists at one point. To me, a made-up stat. But I think that going forward, he will be remembered as a defensive-minded, one of the better defensive players of this decade. He's one of the only guys, him and Kawhi are the only 2 guys this decade, I think, that have 2 Defensive Player of the Year awards. Yeah, it's only Kawhi and Rudy who have 2 Defensive Player of the Year awards. Then you're, of course, the rest of the Defensive Player of the Year: Joakim Noah, Draymond Green, Dwight Howard, and Marc Gasol. All those guys are going to be mentioned later when we get into this stuff. That's going to do it for the show. It's going to be very interesting to see where some of this stuff go. Before we get into it, though, I do want to get into something that we talked about a little bit with Sam OJ earlier on another podcast. And it's interesting because I said Stephon Diggs was going to go to the Bills. He ends up going to the Bills. It's going to be a good one. It's going to be a good season this year for the NFL when it finally kicks off. I'm very excited. That's going to do it for the show. I'll talk to you guys tomorrow when we break down the rest of the list. The next group of guys, very, very, very good. You're going to be very excited to see who comes in between 50 and 35 on the list. I will talk to you guys tomorrow.